It's good to see you all this morning. It's interesting. I appreciate what Tyann shared with communion about kind of praying for the people who are around you. In the first service, she said that, and then I looked and I realized I was sitting alone, which was a little depressing. But it kind of then gave me an opportunity to stop and think, well, instead of just being thankful for the person right next to me, I really reflected on just how thankful I was for all of the people that were there in the room. And really, I'm thankful for you all, too, that you would take the opportunity to be here today. Our family, we just kind of had our 2-year anniversary in Corvallis not too long ago, and we're truly grateful for the way that you all have kind of opened your lives up to us to sort of invite us in. I'm thankful for the privilege to get to work in a place like this where there's wonderful people, like even on a day where our worship pastor is on vacation, there's some incredibly talented people who can step up and lead, and you kind of don't miss a beat. Kind of makes me think maybe we don't need Randy anymore, actually. That's just our little secret, okay? No, and last week when Martha and I were at the couples retreat, Rick jumped in and started a new sermon series for us in such a great way. I mean, it's just a privilege, and I was even thinking about that in the song that we sang. Cannons talks about, I'm so unworthy and still you love me, right? I mean, that's where we all are. I'm just really grateful for the fact that God chooses to use all of us. I mean, I know I don't lead perfectly here. I make a lot of mistakes. I don't preach perfectly here. I make a lot of mistakes. And my wife and kids are here. They can tell you that, even though I know I shouldn't do it anymore, I still get angry and snap at them at home sometimes. And yet, even though I don't always get it right, God still loves us. He still accepts me. He still has a place for me, and he hasn't given up on me and is still working with me. So anyway, I'm just kind of coming today from a place of real gratitude for an awful lot of things. But actually, mentioning that we've been here for a couple of years reminded me of a story I was thinking about this week. So question, have you guys ever noticed that sometimes you see a picture of something, and then when you see it in reality, like the picture and the reality don't quite match up? So we moved here a couple years ago, and it was actually in October that we came out and the church voted to offer me this job. But we didn't want to move the kids, during the school semester, so that the family moved out in December, which meant that I came out in November to get started, and I needed to find a place to live. And we knew that eventually we wanted to buy, but we didn't see anything right away, so we thought, well, we'll rent for a little while and kind of, get the lay of the land. Well, I don't know if you guys have noticed this about Corvallis, but there are a lot of college students here. So when you try to rent something in November, like after the school year has already started, there are not a lot of options out there. But it's okay. Martha and I, we looked online. We found a couple that looked good with the pictures. So we got here, and I remember driving up to one of them, and I get out of the car, and I look at the house. And I'm like, I must have got the address wrong. So I look, and I'm like, no, it's the right address. And I look at the picture, and I look at the house. I look at the picture, and I look at the house. And then I start looking around, and I'm like, how did they? And I realized that to get this picture that made the house look really nice, somebody actually had to go across the street and climb a tree so that they could get the picture from just the right angle so that you saw the house in the best light, and you didn't see the house next door that had a tarp covering up most of its roof. And you didn't see the enormous dog kennel in the house right here with these giant dogs that barked all the time in it. So it was one of those things where I was like, wow, the reality just doesn't quite match up to the picture that I saw. And sometimes when you see things in real life and you've got this picture, you've got some expectations of what it's going to be, sometimes reality just doesn't match up to our expectations. And this morning, I actually want us to look together at a story from the Gospel of Matthew that I think kind of talks about that, about some of the ways that Jesus challenged the expectations of the people around him. So if you could, I'd love to invite you to turn with me in the Bible to Matthew chapter 8. If it would help you for any reason, there's some red Bibles in those seats in front of you. And if it would help, you can grab one and turn to the page number that's there on the screen. But as you're turning there's several of you that I haven't had a chance to meet before, so just want to introduce myself. My name is Mike King, and I'm one of the pastors up here at Suburban. And this morning, we're continuing on in a sermon series that we're calling 4 Portraits. Now, basically, a lot of us who are familiar with the Bible know that the New Testament starts off with not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 different biographies of Jesus that come back to back to back. We know them as the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they all kind of go together. And right now, we're in the middle of a sort of a project as a church where we're reading together through those Gospels as we approach Easter. So if you're not doing that, we actually have a little bookmark that we made. It's out in the Welcome Center. It's got a reading plan. We're just reading 1 chapter a day with the goal that as many of us as possible, we're going to try to read through these 4 biographies of Jesus together as a way to prepare ourselves for Easter. And if you haven't been reading along, it's really not too late to start. You can grab one of those bookmarks and just jump in where we are or try to get caught up, whatever's going to work for you. But would encourage you to do that because the sermon each week in the series is kind of based on something that we've all been reading together in the week before. And we're calling this series Four Portraits because I think that's really what the Gospels are. Right? The Gospels are biographies of Jesus, but they're not the modern biographies that we think of. They're really more ancient biographies. So I don't know about you all, but when I read a biography, like I read a biography not too long ago of Abraham Lincoln, right? I tend to think about biographies as photographs, right? We want these just the facts presentations of the person. So this biography said, well, he was born on this day, and this is what the log cabin was like, and here are some of the early influences in his life. And it gives you this sort of orderly account of all the details that you want to know. Well, that's what modern biographies are like. They're kind of like photographs. But ancient biographies really aren't like that. The ancient biographers were really not trying to give you a just the facts presentation of a person's life. Instead, they had a particular agenda in mind. They had one aspect of a person's life that they wanted to highlight and comment on and talk about. So they would definitely take the events of the person's life and tell them to you, but they would pick which ones they wanted to tell. And they were really selective in how they arranged it so they could really try to drive something home. And in that sense, these ancient biographies are a lot more like portraits that an artist would paint of a person than they are of a photograph. Like if you think about it, you can Google like a portrait of somebody. And if you look at different paintings that somebody does of the same person, it is amazing how different those paintings can be, even though they're of the same subject. Because it just all depends on what it is that the author, the artist is trying to emphasize, what aspect of that person's life they want to show, where they are, or what it is they're doing. It's just a way to sort of see them from a different angle. And that's really what these four biographies of Jesus are. These ancient biographies, I think, give us slightly different views into the person and the life of Jesus, so that when we read them together, we come away with a fuller picture of this life that really did change human history in some transformative ways. And this morning, the passage that we're reading comes from Matthew's ancient biography of Jesus, which is really just a fascinating book in a lot of ways. One of the things that Matthew is trying to do, right, one of his sort of unique takes, his unique angle that he's driving at, is he's got a very specific goal in mind. Matthew is trying to convince all the people who are reading his book that Jesus is the Messiah that has been promised all throughout the Old Testament. Now, if you're not familiar with that term Messiah, Messiah comes from a Hebrew word that means the anointed one. And really, it was a term that historically was used to describe like a king, right? If a king is sort of being commissioned for his kingly job, they would actually take oil and they would anoint. They'd put him on his head as sort of the symbolic sort of conferring of God's power and grace and blessing. It's sort of he's commissioned and charged to go off and do this work. So typically the people who were anointed in Israel's history were kings. They were heroes that were there to lead the nation. And at the time that Jesus was alive, the nation of Israel really needed a hero because they had had a pretty rough stretch of it for 600 or 700 years. Right? Over the last 600 or 700 years, they had been conquered by different empires. They had been hauled off into exile. They had returned. And eventually they came back. But over the centuries, just empire after empire would come through and take over their land. The Greeks would be in charge for a while, and then the Romans would come. They'd drive the Greeks out. But through it all, the people of Israel were always under the thumb of some other army. And in that sense, many of them got to the point where they just sort of felt abandoned by God. Because God had made these promises for who they were going to be and how they were going to bless them. And just century after century, they hadn't seen the reality of that play out. But they didn't give up hope that it would come one day. Because they went back to their scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, and they saw these promises that God had made over and over again that he was going to send someone, the Messiah, who was going to save and rescue and deliver his people. So for centuries in these hard times, right, the people of Israel had been hanging on to that hope. And as the centuries went by, they began to develop some very clear expectations of who that Messiah was and what it was that Messiah was going to do. In fact, they imagined that the Messiah was going to be this really charismatic kind of military leader, somebody who could rally the people of Israel to him and form together an army who could take up arms and drive whatever empire happened to be there out. And in fact, they had some real historical examples of this in mind. This is actually a comic book version from a kid, but it's a picture of one of these heroes. So about 150 years before Jesus was born, a man named Judas Maccabee led a revolt against the Greeks, sort of the Greek Seleucid Empire that was in charge at the time. But he really gathers some people together, and they drive the Greek out. And for this really brief window, the people of Israel were in charge of their own nation again, because this Messiah-like figure, this sort of warrior, had risen up to bring people to him. So this is the expectation that a lot of people had. There's still this historical memory of what it would be like to be free again. And the way we get there is for the Messiah to come and sort of raise this army. And now here's the thing. Matthew is 100% absolutely convinced that Jesus is the Messiah that the Old Testament prophesies about. And in fact, more than any of the other Gospels, he goes to incredible lengths to show people that Jesus is the Messiah that was promised. Right? Probably about 100 times in that Gospel, he refers back to the Old Testament, or he looks at specific prophecies that were made back then and says, hey, do you know what? Jesus is fulfilling this prophet right now. He's the Messiah. I told you so. But Jesus was not the kind of Messiah that people were expecting. That's one of the reasons that Matthew has to do so much work to try to show you that he really is the Messiah, because he just completely sort of broke with all of the expectations that people had at the time. And in a sense, it's kind of like my quest for a rental house. I got there and I realized that the expectations that I had didn't line up with the reality of it. The difference, though, is when you think about sort of the expectations that Jesus is breaking, the rental house that I found was a lot lousier than the expectations that I had. But in Jesus, we actually find a Messiah who's much greater than the expectations that people had. They were expecting something like this, but you end up getting something like this. And the point that Matthew tries to make over and over and over again is that while Jesus wasn't the Messiah that people were expecting, he was absolutely the Messiah that they needed. Right? He was not the picture they had in mind. He was not what they expected was going to come. But in so many ways, he was more than what was expected. He was what they truly needed, that they didn't even know that he would need. And as you read through the beginning of Matthew, you see that Jesus begins to sort of show that he's a different kind of Messiah. Because instead of, sort of rallying the troops and let's call the army, the very first thing that he starts doing is sort of breaking down the barriers that keep people separated from each other, or that keep people separated from God, showing that in him, now these barriers are coming down and everyone has an invitation to come and to live the full, free lives that God created them to live. And you see that play out all through the book. So Matthew starts out, Rick was here last week kind of talking about the beginning of Matthew. You get the story of his birth and his family tree, and then Jesus is baptized and he calls the first disciples to him. And then in chapters 5 through 7, he delivers his first public teaching. It's what we know as the Sermon on the Mount, and it's probably the greatest sermon that has ever been preached. In fact, people all throughout the world, all throughout human history, even people who aren't Christians, they have really liked this sermon. They've seen it as a source of incredible teaching and wisdom, so people as diverse as Gandhi and Thomas Jefferson, Martin Luther King, they took great inspiration from that sermon. So if you've never read that for yourself, you should spend some time this week reading Matthew's chapter 5, 6, and 7, because there's wonderful things in there. And if you look at the very end of chapter 7, that's where we're going to pick off today, because Jesus just finishes teaching this like the best sermon ever, and this is what it says. It says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, not as their teachers of the law. Right? So they're blown away, right? They've never heard anybody preach and teach like this before. So Jesus, kind of drops the mic at the end of the sermon and starts walking down the hill. And they're like, oh my gosh, we've never heard anybody teach like this. Let's follow this guy and see what happens. There's something different about him. So they follow him down the hill. And just like they had been amazed at the fact that he taught with authority, now as they're following him, they begin to see he begins to act with authority. He begins to do things that people aren't doing. And right off the bat, he goes down and he meets this Jewish man who has leprosy. Now, leprosy was a skin disease back in those days. It was pretty contagious. So when somebody had leprosy, they were really cut off from everybody else. They were ceremonially and ritually impure. They were sort of a health hazard. So if you had leprosy, you're really cut off from your family, your friends, your faith, all of it. You're just kind of on your own. And Jesus comes to this guy, this Jewish man, and he heals him. And by doing that, he actually sort of breaks down that barrier between that man and God, that man and his community. He brings him back to his family, back to his friends, back to sort of the ability to live out his faith and to go to the temple and offer sacrifices. And the crowd, I'm guessing, is kind of blown away, right? Because they're like, okay, well, this guy might be the Messiah. This is a little different than I thought the Messiah would do. He's not calling an army together. He's healing people. But that's pretty amazing. And, I don't know, maybe he's going to heal people, and then his army will be all the people he healed. I mean, you kind of see the wheels turning. But then what comes next? This is the part of the story where Jesus really, I think, starts to mess with people's expectations. So look what it says in verse 5. It says, when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly. Right, so the crowd follows Jesus to Capernaum, which is a town on the northwest edge of the Sea of Galilee. And this is kind of Jesus' home base for ministry in these years. He kind of moves in and out of there. And Capernaum was an important town, right? It's on a major trade route, so a lot of goods are going through there. And because it was on a major trade route, there's a Roman tax office there. So a lot of goods are coming through, which means a lot of money is flowing through, which means there are soldiers there, right? So that's what this centurion is in Capernaum for. And what is it we can know about him, right? Obviously, this centurion's not Jewish. I mean, he's part of the Roman army. So, which is interesting if you stop and think about it. Because some of the expectations for the Messiah, right, was that, this is going to raise up an army and they are going to stick it to the man. Well, the centurion, he's the man, right? He's the one that, they expect that Jesus is there to sort of drive this guy out of the land, which is why I think the crowd must have been surprised, because when he showed up, Jesus responds with compassion. I mean, I think what they were waiting for is like, okay, if he's the Messiah, this is his moment to kind of announce it. The centurion comes up and says, hey, I need your help. And he's going to be like, you know what? We are sick and tired of being under your thumb. I don't care if your servant is sick. I hope he dies, and I hope you die too. I'm not helping you. I mean, that's what the crowd's kind of waiting for. But that's not what Jesus does. Instead, the guy comes, he says, my servant is sick. He's sick at home. And Jesus, what does he say? He says, well, should I come and heal him? Now, again, that's challenging. Whoa, I thought he was going to tell this guy off, but instead he's offering to heal him. So maybe that was a little scandalous for somebody who is maybe going to be the Messiah. But that's nothing compared to what's coming in a minute. So look at this. It says the centurion replied, right? Jesus says, hey, do you want me to go to your house and heal him? The centurion says, Lord, I don't deserve to have you come under my roof. You just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I'm a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one go, and he goes. I tell that one come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. Now, a question for you. Did any of you guys spend any time in the military? I know we have a number of people at Suburban who have done that. My granddad was in the Marines, my father was in the Navy. And when I would talk to my dad and granddad about their time in the service, one thing that was really clear to them is that, like, hey, when you were in the military, you know what authority is, right? If there are people under you, you tell them go and they go. You tell them jump, they say how high. And there are people over you. And if they tell you to jump, you say how high, sir. And that's kind of what this guy's world is, this Roman centurion. He's in the military. He understands how that works. So a Roman centurion would have commanded between 80 and 100-foot soldiers, right? So these are the guys, he says jump, they say how high, sir, yes, sir. But he's not the top of the chain of command either. He's kind of in middle management, to lack of a better word, because centurions had to report up to an officer who was called a tribute, right? The tribute is in charge of a cohort, which is made up of 6 centurions and all of their troops under him. And even that tribute is not the top of the food chain, because he's got to report to the legate, who's the officer in charge of the Roman legion, which is made up of 10 of these cohorts. So this guy's world, he understands how authority works. And something about Jesus, he looks at Jesus. He looks at what Jesus has done and the ways that he's healed and other people can't. And he says, this guy's got authority. And he says, okay, I know how authority works. All this guy has to do with his very words, he can heal people. And he says, I believe Jesus has authority, and then I got this servant who's at home and sick, so why don't I ask him to heal him, and we'll just see what he does. So there they are, and they're sitting there talking, and basically what the centurion gives is this incredibly profound expression of faith. He says, I believe that Jesus can do what he says he's going to do. And then look how Jesus responds. He says, when Jesus heard this, when he heard the faith that the centurion expressed, he was amazed, but he doesn't talk to the centurion first. Instead, he turns to the crowd that's following him, and he says, truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I mean, you know it's a good story when weeping and gnashing of teeth come into it. Now, my guess is that for most of us as modern readers, we don't hear this in the same way that the original audience would have. So let's kind of dig into some of that and see how they maybe understood what was going on. So again, picture the scene. Jesus has just heard this incredible expression of faith and trust from the mouth of this non-Jewish soldier. And he turns to all the Jewish people who are following him and says, guys, I haven't seen faith like this in any of you yet. And then he starts talking about all these different people coming from the east and the west to join the patriarchs, the fathers of the nation of Israel, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at this heavenly banquet. And I think it's that phrase, when he starts talking about many coming from the east and from the west. That's the phrase that would have really rocked the world of the original audience. And here's why. When Jesus was using that line, he's actually echoing back to a number of different promises that God made to the Jewish people in the Old Testament. You remember I mentioned earlier that they've had a rough couple of centuries. So in 722, the Assyrian army comes in, sort of devastates the northern empire, hauls people off into exile. 150 years later, the Babylonians come in, do the same thing to the southern kingdom, haul people off into exile. Some of them end up coming back to Jerusalem. But an awful lot of Jewish people ended up just scattered all around the Mediterranean basin and all these different things. And the people are waiting. They're waiting for the day when God comes back, the Messiah comes back, the nation is put back together. And it's in this window, when they're scattered all around, that God's prophets are speaking words of encouragement to them. And look at what some of those prophecies are. They're promises that God is going to bring his people who are scattered all around, his Jewish people, back from the east and the west. So in Zechariah, he says this. It says, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I will save my people from the countries of the east and the west. Or this one's in Isaiah. So God's speaking to his people. He says, don't be afraid, for I'm with you. I will bring your children from the east and gather you from the west. Or think about in the Psalms, he says this. He says, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Those he redeemed from the hand of the foe. Those he gathered from the lands from east and west. Now, remember, back in that day, nobody had Netflix. So what most of the Jewish people did with the time and the mental energy that they had is they read the Old Testament. And they memorized big sections of the Old Testament. So for them, as they're standing there in the crowd, and Jesus throws out this loaded phrase about people coming from the east and the west, all these alarm bells start going off. They're like, east and west. Well, I remember that promise, and I remember that promise, and then there's that one verse. But think about what they're experiencing when they do that, right? For them, who was God talking to originally in those passages? What was the promise that he was making there? Right? God was promising that he was going to take Jewish people who were scattered all around the world, of the east and west, and bring them back together to be sort of reunited as part of God's people. So when Jesus starts using this phrase from the east and the west, that's the context they had in mind. It was a promise about God bringing the Jewish people back together. But look at what Jesus is doing. He's kind of flipping their expectations of who it is that the Messiah truly came to save. Because Jesus is not using east and west to talk about Jewish people. Jesus is using east and west to talk about people like the centurion, Romans, Gentiles, right? People who didn't have access to God in the way that the Jewish people did. People who didn't have a clear road back to him. People who were cut off from God and God's people. People who were not a part of this amazing project of God's redemptive love in the world that had been up until that point. And in this statement, what Jesus is doing is he is just throwing open the doors so that anyone can come to God. Right? This is this promise of what he came to do. And if you think about it, right, that non-Jewish people can now be part of God's kingdom, that is something that we have benefited from. Because my guess is that pretty much everybody in this room today is not Jewish. Right? So if you are a follower of Jesus and you don't have a Jewish background, this is where your life changed. This is where human history changed for you. This is why this story still matters, why it matters to us, why it makes a difference in our lives. Because right here, Jesus is saying, it does not matter where you were born, right? To be a part of God's kingdom, you don't have to be born in a certain place. You don't have to be part of a certain race. Anybody in the human race can come and can be a part of what it is that God is doing now through Jesus. And see, this is all part of the reason that Jesus is not the Messiah that they were expecting, but he is very much the Messiah that they needed. And he's the Messiah that we need as well. Because again, right here, he opens the door for everybody to come back to God. Even if people, in the original lines, even if when he's saying that, they didn't understand it right away. And they didn't. The Jewish crowds, many of the people when Jesus was alive, they didn't get the full scope of the project of what he was doing. And I don't think we, with the hindsight of 2,000 years of history, should really judge them too harshly for that. Because an awful lot of people in Jesus' day didn't really get what he was up to, including some people that were really close to him. So in fact, if you've been reading along kind of with the reading plan that we're doing this week, one of the stories that you read in Matthew 11 was the story of John the Baptist, right? Rick talked about John last week. He's Jesus' cousin. He baptized him. And in Matthew chapter 11, John finds himself in prison. And here's the thing. John had a certain set of expectations for what the Messiah was going to be. And all of a sudden, he's not free. He's not part of God's reconstituted people. He's in jail. And he starts to wonder, I don't know. Jesus is doing all of these things, but they're not the kind of things I expected the Messiah to do. So he's really got some doubts. So do you know what he does? He gets his disciples together, because he can't leave, because he's in jail. He says, I need you to go to Jesus, and I need you to ask him a question. So they go and they find him, and this is the question they ask. They say, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect somebody else? Jesus, do you understand what the job description is? Because it seems like maybe you're missing the point here, right? Even Jesus' cousin had questions, because he wasn't the Messiah that he was expecting. And that's what the crowd is really struggling with. They're getting this sort of bombshell news dropped in their lap for the very first time that day. But just in case they don't get the point, Look what happens. Jesus takes it a step further. Look what he says at the end of this passage. He's still talking to the Jewish audience. He says, hey, but the subjects of the kingdom are going to be thrown outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So the subjects of the kingdom, that's the Jewish people. That's the people who are there listening to Jesus speak that day. And right, Jesus is drawing this really profound contrast between the faith that this Roman army officer has expressed and this real lack of faith in who he is and what he's doing that he sees among all these Jewish people. And it's like he's saying, guys, your family history doesn't guarantee your future. If you want to be reunited with God, if you want to be part of God's rescued people and live the full free lives that you were created to live, the only way to do that is by having this kind of faith, is by putting your faith in me. And really what he's saying is you need to put your faith in who I actually am, not in who you expect me to be. You need to put your faith in the kind of things that I can do what I actually say I'm going to do, not the things that you just want me to do. So Jesus says that, and then finally he kind of turns, right? And he looks at the centurion, and kind of to drive this point home that he's got the authority to do what he says he can do. He looks at the centurion, and he says this. He says, go, let it be done for you just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that moment. Right then, just with his words, the text says that the servant was healed at that moment. And why does Jesus say that the healing takes place? It's because the centurion believed. And specifically, when you kind of dig into that, what is it that he believed? He believed that Jesus had authority. He believed that he was who he said he was and that he could do what he said he could do. And if you've ever wondered, you hear Christians talk about faith all the time. You got to have faith in Jesus. This is what faith really is. It is simply put, faith is believing that Jesus is who he says he is and that Jesus can do in your life what he says that he can do. So where do we go with this as we prepare to end today? How do we put this into practice? A couple of thoughts come to mind for me. First, as we're reading through the Gospels together over the next month or two, I really think we need to commit to doing it with an open mind. I know that some of us, we've been Christians for a long time, and we've probably read the Gospels 50 times before, and we've heard all these stories in Sunday school as a kid. And I think that's wonderful, but if that is the case, we just need to know we kind of run the risk. If you're reading a story again for the second time, it's kind of like when you have a favorite movie and you watch it for the 50th time, you already know what's going to happen, right? So if you've read these stories and you know these stories, you can go into it kind of not even meaning to, just thinking, yeah, I already know the story. I already know what's going on. And I would even argue that's true even for those of you who wouldn't consider yourselves Christians. If you're reading the Gospels, maybe you're even reading the Gospels for the very first time, you still probably have a picture in your head of who Jesus is, just because of how he's talked about in the world today. Well, he's a great teacher, or he did this. So I think all of us, if we're not careful, we can fall into the very same trap that the Jewish people were doing in this story. All of us tend to build a nice, tidy little box that we want Jesus to fit inside, because that's the Jesus that we want. And we read the text in such a way that we kind of just pay attention to the parts that fit in our box and just sort of ignore the parts that don't. And as we've seen today, Jesus will have none of that, right? Jesus is like, no. I get to define who I am, right? You need to put your faith in who I actually am, not who you think I am. You need to look what I actually say and actually do, not what you hope I will say and what I will do. We need, I think, as we read through this together, to just make a commitment to let Jesus be Jesus, because we're going to learn a lot more that way. And it's true for me as well. I mean, I've obviously read the Gospels before and went to seminary and studied all these things. So if I don't make an effort to do it, I just kind of read them on autopilot. But if I stop at the beginning of the time I'm reading, this is what I've tried to do in the last couple of weeks as we've done this, and say, okay, God, yes, I've read this before, but help me see you as you really are. I mean, almost always when I do that, I read through the chapter and something jumps out at me like, whoa, why did Jesus say that? Or why did he do that? That doesn't fit in the little box that I have for him. And I just think that's a good experience for us to have, to be willing to sort of let Jesus bust out of the boxes that we're in. Because he's not necessarily the Jesus that we expected either. But he's absolutely the Messiah that we also need. So when we let Jesus be Jesus, we end up learning more about who he is and more about the real difference that he can make in our lives. And then, I think once we do that, once we commit to reading through this with an open mind, we all have to ask ourselves the question, okay, what does it mean to respond to this Jesus in faith? That's what the centurion does. He responds in faith to Jesus as he really was, as he saw him, not as he wanted him to be. And again, for those of us who are followers of Jesus, you need to stop and think, okay, what does it mean to really recognize and submit to the authority of Jesus in my life? right? How does his words and his actions, how does that shape my words and my actions and my priorities? Again, if you're already a Christian, reading the Gospels can be a really helpful and encouraging exercise, but it can be pretty challenging and dangerous as well. Because every single time Jesus opens his mouth, you have to stop and think, this is the person that I've committed to do what they say I should do. So then when you read what he says and what he tells you to do, you have to stop and ask, am I doing this? How do I actually faithfully live this out and follow it in my world today? So I'd encourage you just to keep that question front and center as you read this week. Yeah, and again, I think for those of us who are still exploring Christ, the task is very similar. Think about the centurion, right? Jesus pointed to him as this example of faith. Well, what was the substance of his faith? What was the content of his faith? Basically, he had heard about Jesus somehow, right? He knew that this guy was out there healing people, that he had authority and power to do things that other people couldn't do. And he had a need in his life, and he thought, I think Jesus' power can meet that need. So he went and he simply believed that Jesus is who he says he was, and that he could do what he said he could do. And that by submitting to Jesus' authority, by saying, I recognize that you have more authority and more power than me, I put myself under you and ask you to use that authority on my behalf as you see fit, he believed that that could change his life. And it did. So if you're exploring Christ as you read the Gospels with us, that's what I want to encourage you to be on the lookout for as well. As you read through these stories, just look at what Jesus says he came to do. Look at who he says he is. And then just ask yourself the question, do you believe it? Do you believe that he has authority? That he is who he claims to be, that he can do what he claims to do? And obviously wrapped up in that claim is the claim he makes that in him we can find forgiveness for our sins. That's a free gift of God's grace, but that as we put our trust and faith in him, we can actually put back in a right relationship with God and a right relationship with the people around us. And, as you read through that, if you come to the point where you realize, I actually do believe that he is who he says he is. I actually do believe that he can do in me, in my heart, in my life, in my family, what he says he can do. Then you're at the point where you're ready to cross that line of faith and to put your trust and your faith in him as the Lord and the leader of your life. And, when you get to that point, we would love to have a conversation with you about that. Maybe that's today you've gotten to that point, or maybe at some point during this program. We just want you to know every single Sunday, when you leave this place, you can go out those doors and take a right, and there's a prayer room. And there are folks in there each Sunday after every single service that would love the opportunity to talk with you about the decisions that you're making and talk about what some next steps might be to really get you sort of moving down that road towards a life with Jesus well. So here's what I want us to do. The musicians are going to come forward, and we're going to sing a final song together that kind of gives us an opportunity to give voice to some of what we've talked about today. But as I do that, I just want to invite you all to pray with me. So would you do that? God, thank you for the opportunity that we have to be here together today. Oftentimes I look at the Bible and the way that you have chosen to work in the world and in human history, and I think, this is probably not the plan I would have come up with. Working through broken people like me? I mean, surely you've got better options than using us. And yet, God, in your wisdom, this is what you've chosen to do. Right? You look at us, we're broken people, we don't always get it right, but you want to work through us anyway because you love us. Right? You accept us as we are, but you love us too much to let us stay that way. You realize that we're more broken than we're ever going to know, but you love us more than we can imagine. So God, as we read this week, as we study scriptures, maybe as we go back and read your teachings in the Sermon on the Mount, would you just open our eyes to who you really are? We've all got a box that we want to cram you into. You're the God of the universe, like we sang about today, right? The galaxies sing your praise. This whole universe hangs together at your word and your power. You're not going to fit in any kind of box we made for you. So would you give us the grace of breaking those boxes open? Help us see you as you came. Help us let Jesus be Jesus. And then, Lord, help us know what it looks like for each of us to respond with faith to who you are and to what you want to do in us and through us. And then as we see that, give us the courage to take that step. Amen.